Welcome to the basic past, present, and future talk. So I've gone back and forth for the last couple of months trying to figure out exactly what I'm going to do. And I decided it's the wrong title. So it's actually Basic, a Story. And I also am not a big fan of PowerPoint slides. So they're really basic. And just kind of broke it down. What you're going to see on screen, take with a grain of salt. Obviously, I didn't even exist in 1964, so I have to go off of hearsay. But I do want to start. The beginning of BASIC is, of course, the May 1st, 1964 is the official, quote, accepted birth date. And it actually started obviously before that because they were trying to solve a problem. The computer languages at the time were complicated, and it also combined with the ability to get users access to the equipment. So it's a combined effort. There's BASIC and the Dartmouth time sharing system, and BASIC helped succeed. The two helped each other succeed. So moving a little bit forward, the story that I'm going to go with here is that there's the before I existed. So we're just going to kind of cover some of the hot points as I see. And then once I come into the picture, I'll kind of give you my involvement and kind of my take and why I'm still a fan of BASIC. So obviously it grew. The first time that it was made available to, I spelled wrong. That's forever immortalized. So there you go. Apparently there's no AI in PowerPoint. So along with making it available to high school students, the second version of BASIC came into existence. So the first version had a very few number of keywords and had literally no ability for any input from the user. You wrote code, you executed code, and unlike what most people seem the common story is, that version of BASIC was compiled from day one. So whatever code you wrote was compiled and you got a result. So much so that the first version, what's there to interpret? It was literally feed it in, it came out, and you were done. So the second was released. That improved a couple of things, like the print statement being one of them. And 1966, the third came out. I love these version numbers. Incidentally, trying to find documentation actually on each one of these versions is proving to be challenging. You can find it on the first because they made that available on the 50th anniversary. So it made it a lot easier to find. The third, can't find much on it. I haven't been able to. But then in 1967, the PDP-10, thereabouts, again, take this with a grain of salt. It might be a year or two off. Because I'll also share that part of this was written with ChatGPT. Because why not? Why is the introduction of the PDP-10 important? Because it supported BASIC, and that made BASIC elsewheres. However, there's more to this in the fact that during this time frame, people were writing video games on these computers, in time-sharing systems, on these devices, and they were being written in BASIC. So as we progress, BASIC the fourth was released. And then 1969, the fifth version of BASIC was released. And this is, there's a little bit of a mix up here. Some people say the fourth, some people say the fifth. However, 1969 is also an important part of in general history, and that is the landing on the moon. And what thing transpired that's related to the landing on the moon and BASIC is that lunar lander was created in response to landing on the moon. And of course, written in BASIC. So, and of course, because it was on these systems were loosely connected and working with one another, that version of the game could easily make its way to other machines. Now, the other thing about the fourth and the fifth, I'm going to go with the fifth, is that this is about the time frame that the mass copying and replication of BASIC on other machines started to take place. So what I mean by that is obviously the Dartmouth version of BASIC is not the only BASIC that existed at this time. People were coming up with their own versions. Now, for those that aren't really aware, one of the things about BASIC, there's a couple of things before we move into the 1970s, is several key things occurred during this time frame. One, our tax dollars helped pay for this. So the National Science Foundation helped fund this process. So it was ours from the very beginning. Second, there was no copyright or trademark mechanisms put in place. This was made freely available for the world. That eventually comes back to bite Kimony and Kurtz in the rear end. And I'll get to that in a moment. But the reality is there was nothing preventing this from ending up everywhere. And everywhere it went. As a side note, before I get to the 1970s, I'll put out a public request. If anybody has any school textbooks that has basic code examples in it, I would love to get a few copies of those. So if anybody ever comes up with that, let me know. It's being impossible for me to find them. So 1970, again, other machines are now shipping, and other versions of BASIC are now shipping. And there's kind of a blurb up there about that. It's still kind of the same BASIC for all intents and purposes. How many people are in here are familiar with the basic computer games 1 and 2? So a few. So that's the kind of BASIC we're talking about here. Okay. Again, PDP 11, and then quote BASIC the 6th. Not much to say about BASIC the 6th. It's kind of just still an iteration, but this starts to mark the end of Dartmouth BASIC in the fact that structured programming becomes a thing. And this is about the same time that the infamous article was published about GoTo considered harmful. There's something important that people tend to not pay attention with that article is that, first off, GoTo is 2 words. It's not 2 words in this BASIC. Second, it's about spaghetti code and code that's not maintainable. And that's a style of development, not necessarily the language itself. One can, in fact, build structured code in the BASIC that had line numbers. You could actually, in some versions, you could tab. Not on any of the machines we probably worked with, but in the real world, academia, I'll come back to that in a minute, this was a thing. And structured programming was not new in 1972. This is just when it started taking root in different programming languages in general. And of course, there was a project at Dartmouth where they were taking BASIC the 6th, transforming it into a structured BASIC, and that basically means dropping all line numbers and introducing, loop constructs and those sorts of things. So 1973, it's finally released. BASIC the 6th is HP, so on and so forth, and there's more effort on BASIC the 6th, structured BASIC, and then this is where things get really interesting. So around the early 1970s, Kimony and Kurtz realized that in order for BASIC to be better, because, it being popular and available on several machines and, propagating like crazy, maybe they should do something and make it more standard. So that begins. 1974, by the way. That committee continues to meet and continues to meet and continues to meet. However, in 1975, while that committee is still meeting, a young guy named Bill Gates decided that it would be really cool to make a version of BASIC for this little hobbyist computer. And, if you don't know this history, I strongly encourage you to look at that history because pretty awesome machine. I know I've seen one floating around here somewhere. And its better cousin, the MSI. So, I hope everyone knows the MSI is the one that was in War Games. So just making sure you understand that because that's important. War dialers are important. So anyway, a lot of this, there's a whole story around how this came about, but obviously people know that Bill Gates made a version of BASIC for the Altair, and he also got to retain the rights to it, which is an important thing. So Altair's out there selling their things, producing these tapes, providing it to their customers, so on and so forth. And shortly thereafter is Tiny Basic. Tiny Basic actually wasn't something that was made as a product. It was more of a magazine article and an idea. And then a bunch of other people decided to implement it. And when I say a bunch of other people, there's at least 12 different versions by 1976. So what makes Tiny Basic different, for the most part, is that it was an integer-only BASIC, so it had limitations in what you could do numerically, and had a really small footprint. One of the reasons why Microsoft BASIC was the size that it was is because of all the floating point math. That makes up a huge portion of the original Microsoft BASIC. So it could fit in a smaller space, and it was published and made freely available. And at the bottom here, you'll see that there's this text information on there about all wrongs reserved, copy left. The reason why that was put in there, to make it clear that this was not copyrighted and was freely available, is because Bill Gates blew a gasket because people were pirating his software. Apparently it was pretty easy to copy tapes, paper tapes. So he wanted his money. Now, 1976, Microsoft is officially incorporated, and there's a reason why you're going to see Microsoft from this point on quite a bit, and that is, well, they won. That's the reason. He's the winner. And if you don't believe me, go find a machine that's of the era and just point to me which version of BASIC is not theirs. And there are a few. There are a few that is not Microsoft, and they're pretty cool. But I will promise you, you will find more machines that have Microsoft BASIC on it than not, by a huge, huge margin. Here, let me help you out with the ones that don't. Sinclair and BBC Micro. Apple One. But beyond that, yeah, they all start to be basically Microsofts. And if they're not Microsofts, they're heavily copying Microsoft, or they're just outright thievery. So anyway, BASIC continues to grow. Commodore PET, there's a whole story there. I do want to kind of touch on that for a second. But basically, there were the big three computers came out around this time. And I'm listing two of them. Noticeably, there's one that's not up there. Can you guess which one it was? Apple. That's correct. So I was quickly doing these, and I didn't want to spend a ton of time on the slides. So I'm just trying to get to, where I come into the picture. What else happened in 1977? Well, there's this Atari thing. That was pretty cool. Couldn't program on it. Not for another 2 years. We'll touch on that in a second. And let's see what else. Star Wars, I think, was around this time, right? And if you were a 7-year-old kid, in my case, 6-year-old kid, and you saw Star Wars, you wanted an R2-D2, which is a computer on wheels.
What, did you get a toy of it?
I did. I think all my toys I remember of that age, yeah, they were Star Wars. So 1978. Remember that conversation that occurred back in 1974 about the minimal BASIC? They finally got done talking for the minimal BASIC. The full BASIC one, they're still having conversation about. This is 3 years after Bill Gates is going, I don't care what y'all guys are doing. I'm making money. So let's see. I don't know what else I wrote up there. Oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. A lot of computers using it. Okay. So 1979, another version of BASIC, AppleSoft BASIC. And then again, the world starts changing again. And this big box, this questionably designed architecture, questionably chosen parts for a platform that had 2 colors at best, maybe 4 that you could plug into a TV. Shipped with 64K of RAM. Like all the other computers that already existed that had more colors and stuff. It came about, but it did ship with BASIC. Huh? Oh yeah, the machines had sound. I mean, it had a beep. It did have a beep. It did have a beep. Beep lives on. It's an important thing. Beep is not dead yet. So, however, again, Microsoft managed to pull off another huge boon for themselves in the fact that they retain the rights. So they retain the rights not only to the BASIC, they also retain the rights to the operating system. And so shortly thereafter, we started seeing machines that kind of were the beginning of the end for all the other machines. And that was the clones. So now 1981, I have to step back about 2 years, and I'm in elementary school, and for fear of hurting things, I did not bring that particular book, but before I need it in a minute, let me grab these. That was talent. So before we continue into the 80s, there's a couple of things I want to show. So first off, in the early days of computing and BASIC, everything you needed to know could fit in a little pamphlet like this. Look how thick that is. That's super thick, right?
Yeah.
And this is actually for the Model 4, the TRS-80 Model 4, the last of the TRS-80 of that kind. But yeah, all the commands, everything else you need to know is right here, nice and compact. The other thing is there's a lot of conversations that take place on the internet, because people love having conversations on the internet, and by conversations I mean arguments, and everybody's right. I did manage to come across this book. It's kind of pricey at this point. It's not very thick, again, very, very thin book. It has a whopping 150 pages or so in it, of which these first 75 matter and the other 75 do not. And it's a book attributed to being written by, whether it's actually written by them or not, I don't know. But it's their conversation, their words, Kimony and Kurtz. And it's titled Back to Basic, and it's written in the style of True Basic. So I mentioned a few years back, I was going to cover a couple of things. So at some point, they got upset that this was available on all these other machines. And they were encouraged by a bunch of their students to form an actual company, a for-profit, for the product that other people are already making money off of, Bill Gates, and try to compete against these other companies, Bill Gates. And, they could do better because, they came up with it, right? And the important thing that's in this book that really is something I want to highlight, and it comes up in conversation quite a bit, is that there are some core principles of the design of the actual language. And there's 8 of them, so I'll go quickly. It should be easy to learn for the beginner. Now, yes, it's basic, beginner, all-purpose symbolic instruction code. Apparently, a lot of people believe that because it has the word beginner in it, it's only for beginners. That's not what it says here. What it says here is it should be easy to learn for the beginner. I guess other people decided that at the end of that, it also says, and discarded once you know what you're doing. How dare the language grow and adapt and become better for the people that know more? I'll get to the other principle that covers that. So it should be a general purpose language allowing writing of any program. So again, the all-purpose part, right? Which, if it's all-purpose, how exactly is that limited to only beginners? This is the important one. Number 3. This is the one that nobody seems to understand. A lot of people don't understand, and some people do get it. So advanced features had to be added so that if there was a price, it was paid by the expert, not the novice. It's literally the third principle. And then it goes on and says, should take full advantage of the fact that the user could interact with the computer. Well, duh. That's kind of a growing of computing in general. Spoiler, so are the rest. It should have error messages that were clear and friendly to the user. You know, unlike the TRS-80 Model 1, which was, what were the two errors? Oops is one of them, and
SN error.
I don't even think it was SN error.
Level 1 basic.
Yes.
How and sorry.
Yes. What, how, and sorry. And another version of BASIC, I know they had oops. So it should have good error messages, right? It should give fast response for small programs. And so this is actually my complaint, my specific complaint, fast forward a little bit while we're covering these, is QB64 is an example that fails at that particular thing. And in some ways, I would say Visual Basic on .NET, it's very fast in giving you results, but boy, getting set up and getting ready to get to the point where you can get something in there in order for it to give you results, it's not so fast. Let's see, no understanding of the hardware should be necessary. Well, we've already solved that problem by just having computing devices that we can't understand anyway. And it should the user, it should shield the user from the operating system. Wait, our entire 80s was a lie. BASIC was the operating system. So in any case, the other thing that's interesting in this book is, and I love this naming, and I've decided to internalize it and accept it as for what it is. All of us have been using Street Basic, unless you are, of course, a Dartmouth Basic person or a True Basic person. You are guilty of being Street Basic. So we are definitely in the right crowd. So, like I said, the first 75 pages are pretty good. It kind of goes into the history and such. I do recommend this. I just don't recommend somebody spending $75 for it. If anyone is so inclined to bring a device to me and scan this in, it'd be great for it to be able to get out into the public. But $75 is just too much. So I did not spend $75. I bought it long enough ago that wasn't the case. So, okay, we're leaving that in there for a moment because we get to move on. So GW Basic. Out of curiosity, what do y'all think GW stands for?
Go away.
So GWiz is the accepted standard. However, there's really no actual answer to the question. Was it Gates William? Maybe. As it turns out, there's another guy with the same initials that was involved in working on this. I don't remember his name.
So it wasn't Watts.
No. So it's definitely not Gates Waz. So what does it stand for? Accepted answer is GWiz. Goes towards the whole graphical elements of it, which I kind of find really interesting because, all this was on the color computer, right? It had lines, it had circles, it had paint, I'm just thinking of some of the other commands.
It still does.
And it still does. It absolutely, actually, you're absolutely right. The color computer still does have those commands. I was using this morning. And then the other thing that, and I want to kind of touch on that for a second. So arguably the number one selling personal computer of the 1980s was, of course, the Commodore 64. Due to issues, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room, so I don't know what the complete details are. But some of the elements surfaced are that Commodore made their deal with Microsoft, and it was a pretty sweet deal, and they somehow repurposed that from the Commodore PET into the Commodore 64, and they didn't want to spend one more dime, so that's why people who used Commodore 64s had to peek and poke everything, and did not have line commands and circle commands and other fun drawing commands like draw.
Trammell cut a deal with Gates because Gates wanted to. He didn't think the 65, which converted the basic would amount to anything, so he just
right.
to a bunch of laptops.
Yes.
And Trammell decided, well, I have to pay him again.
Yep. And that's how all these Commodore 64 people got to suffer. However, they won. I don't know about you, but in the 1980s, I had a modem and a color computer. It was great. I had all the software on it. It was wonderful. But every BBS I connected to was pretty much Commodore 64. It always made my head scratch going, but how do you write code? So it's a whole lot of peeks and pokes. So anyway, GW Basic is still a continuation of that. It kind of existed before the PC in the form of color computer as one of many examples. The MSX is another example. So I don't want to leave them out. It's not here. It was over there. But it did exist. It was a thing. And 1982, Commodore 64. I'm sorry. You guys had to suffer. However, I want to point out these other, and it's 1982, might be 1981. The dates are fuzzy. Did y'all realize there's like a whole computing industry that occurred overseas
No.
that wasn't here? So my wife is from Cambridge, England, and we take our two daughters to England to visit their grandmother and uncle, and it took me 3 times going into the computing museum that's there to realize that, wait, Cambridge is actually the epicenter of this. So I didn't realize any of that. Hard-headed American. However, I do want to point out that while I was there, helping me understand this more and getting more interested in different versions of BASIC that weren't Microsoft, is that museum there is pretty cool. It's not often you go into a museum and you walk out with artifacts. So I was making the comment that I'm really into BASIC. Where can I buy these books? And they said, oh, they're available everywhere for 9p. That's like pennies here, kind of thing. And they gave me a copy of one of the BBC Micro manuals and 30 days of BASIC, I think is what it's called. Incidentally, sounds like a really cool program. How come we didn't have that here? And there's other stuff that happened over there too that I'm over here going, hey, why didn't we do any of this? Their online stuff was way better than what we had. Didn't win, but it was way better. And before us. So now we get into, oh, that image is supposed to be over here. Anyway, I talked about these guys being upset. And I don't know that it was deservingly so. I just feel like they kind of were missing out. I don't know. I don't have any inside track. But what year is this? 1983. So up to this point, my ability to work with computers was limited to whatever I could get into school. Let's just say that I didn't have a lot of money. My family didn't have a lot of money. And about this time frame was when I started realizing that if I continued on the path that I was on, it was going to be, let's see, I was either going to be a roofer or someone cleaning auto parts. Specifically starters and alternators. Spent my time, my hands in gasoline as solvent in order to clean off these machineries. Neither one of those sounded attractive to me. So, this computer thing looks pretty cool. So this is about the time frame that I really started diving in deep. So I had a little bit of exposure to it in elementary school. Didn't actually have any of the devices. And about this time, I went out and earned some money on my own. And this is about the time that I actually purchased my first computer. And it was wonderful. It was great. This little card here, it wasn't as powerful as the TRS-80 Model 4. Not even close. It was the color computer MC10. That was an awesome machine. And guess what I had? I had the color computer MC10. You know what other peripherals I had for it? My fingers. So no way to save anything. I had to write stuff on paper. All my programming was done on that. I've told this story to a couple of people. I basically have kind of like a small amount of PTSD with that little machine. I actually have it in a box. I have one of it in a box. It never comes out. There's just nothing that interests. On the nostalgic side, I'm like, I had one of these. So I have one, but I'm like, I don't want to do anything with it. I just don't want to do anything with it. So, and of course, after that, I eventually got a color computer too. And that grew to having tons and tons of everything you can imagine. So
It's your grain of sand in your pearl.
it is definitely that. And of course, the entire time that I'm working through this stuff, I'm being told by my stepdad that this will never amount to anything. Why am I wasting my time? Why? I mean, do something real, right? And I'm like, but I am doing something real. Have you not seen these BBSs? Look at this world. There's a whole world out here. And so, incidentally, Microsoft started having compilers. Now, this is one of the things I kind of want to... This is a train ride. And I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I want you to see this train ride occur. So, I talked about Dartmouth Basic in the beginning was compiled. Then we had the personal computing revolution, and those basics were all interpreted. Of course, everybody thinks BASIC is interpreted. Somehow that stuck. What's happened, though, is actually these interpreted ones came out, and then people figured out that they want speed, but they don't want to change the language that they're in, so they, would be willing to pay for compilers. So people started making compilers. Bill Gates. It's a trend here. So compilers did start to exist. And eventually we move into Quick Basic, and I'm, ignore Quick Basic 2. Let's just jump ahead, right? Because blah, 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 more basic. Incidentally, Borland said, hey, we need to get on this basic train too. How many people actually use Turbo Basic? There's 1, 2. Welcome to the party. The menus are better in Quick Basic 4.5. I'm just going to point that out. Oh, wait, back up. I forgot to mention this nobody, Alan Cooper, started working on something. We'll come back to him in a minute. Oh, incidentally, look up there. The specification for Standard Basic. Yeah, it's a little late. Microsoft already won. If you want to know which version of Basic is the Standard Basic, well, it's whichever one you learned. I mean, truthfully, and then the follow-up from there. No, really, which one is the standard one? It depends on, are you here or are you over there? If you're here, it's Microsoft Basic. If you're over there, it's BBC Basic.
So Anthony Lott?
Huh?
Anthony Lott?
Yeah.
They were consumed by the board.
They were.
Software meeting.
So again, we'll kind of skip past there. At some point, Microsoft even thought Quick Basic on Mac was a good idea. It is a thing. Incidentally, it's only one thing. There it is. That's the one version. So what I left out of here is, the Amiga computer also came out in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, and it's a phenomenal machine. About this time, I'm knee deep in Quick Basic 4.5. I think Quick Basic 4.5 is like the best thing ever. And I didn't know any better. There was actually better. I didn't get there yet. But about this time, I'm still not quite there. So I lost my train of thought. So the QB45 is the greatest thing ever. And then about this time frame, a friend of mine and myself, we decided to start a BBS. And in doing so, we actually had a reason for doing a BBS. It wasn't just to get onto the craze of having a BBS, because, there were people that did that, and that's fine. And we weren't into it to have, a wares download location. We actually had no downloads. We were one of the BBSs that had 0. So what we did do is we got interested in this idea of making doors. So doors are basically sub-applications inside of BBS. So you would sign into a BBS, and then you would be able to go to a menu item and go into like a game.
Isn't it on separate servers too? Like it would just directly connect you to that server?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and as it turned out, this is a repeat in my story. You don't write those in Quick Basic. You don't write those in Basic. You write that in something else. Like, why not? Why can't we write that in Basic? So we did. And we started a BBS. It was called Hackers R Us. And the doors that we were creating were recreating MS-DOS computing, and had a story around this idea of you were a janitor in the dark in a corporate environment, and you saw a blinking cursor, and it got your curiosity. Why a janitor? I have no idea. I didn't make up the story. My friend was much better at that. So I wrote the code. He did the storyline. He was the person that was capable of getting in front of people and, being outgoing. Decided to be a juggler, an entertainer. So anyway, what much better at that, but I did the coding. And of course I'm like, no, I'm going to write in BASIC and you're not going to stop me. However, at the same time, I got to see an Amiga because that's what he had. Man, I was jealous. However, have y'all ever tried the Microsoft BASIC on the Amiga?
No.
It's pretty bad. It's awesome on paper, but the implementation is horrid. It is one of the slowest BASICs I've ever put my hands on.
I ran this one with basic.
Yeah. So, but it had a whole lot more colors. It had sprites. It had collision detection. I mean, it was great. Around the end of 1980s, I'm getting ready to graduate high school. We're running a BBS, and I'm knee deep in Quick Basic because it's awesome, right? And the BBS eventually had to get a name change. So let me back up again on the doors. So the doors itself, we mimicked MS-DOS. And in mimicking MS-DOS, we also were mimicking GW Basic. And you could use GW Basic to hack around inside of the environment. And the game itself was to uncover the secrets. And of course, there were hidden files and everything else. And this BBS actually grew to be pretty big. And because of its name and what we were doing, it attracted the attention of a 3-letter acronym agency.
Which one?
Let's just say this was long enough ago, they didn't know where we were. So they politely asked us for the user list, explaining that we weren't in trouble. They were just, they'd like to keep tabs on the people that are doing the activities that we were doing. Completely legal. However, they could be doing them not so legal elsewhere. Oh yeah, we also had a ATM hack a door, so we had that too. We politely declined, and we then renamed it to Janitors R Us because that was the main character, was a janitor. So that's how we get to the janitor. However, I do want to point out they didn't know where we were. This BBS was hosted on Carswell Naval Air Station in the barracks by an airman.
You didn't mention that.
So they didn't have to ask. So about this time, I graduate high school, and this is where my career begins. 1989, 1990 is about the time that I go to work for this small company that I'm sure all of you have heard of, Radio Shack. And my job is primarily, getting up inside of the attics of businesses and running network cables, because, that's fun. And building machines in order to deliver to customers. I actually worked at the Tandy Radio Shack Computer Center, west side of Fort Worth. Worked there for a couple of years, so 89, 90-ish. The dates are fuzzy. I slept since then. I just remember the corner of it. It's no longer a Radio Shack, just pointing that out, because there aren't any. Ish. So I was also introduced to the fact that there was a more professional version of Quick Basic. It jumped up to version 7.1 and had QBX.exe, which was still QB.exe, just could handle better memory management. So there's also this point about, hey, this work begins on this little other technology, that we might have heard of, that's going to be happening with this video. And Power Basic, because Turbo Basic was so successful, he was able to buy it back from them and start his own company. Incidentally, if nobody's ever used Power Basic, absolutely phenomenal product. I would argue that he was probably the smartest compiler maker to ever exist on the planet. Because he could do things in Power Basic, speed-wise, that nobody else could touch.
Oh, heck, I still use it.
It's just too bad that that legacy is not continuing on. So, but for what it was, when it was, really awesome. 1991, DOS 5 ships, and we get QBasic 1.0, which now everybody has access to it. It costs nothing because, everyone pirated MS-DOS anyway. And you can, at the same time that they released this wonderful QBasic 1.0 product as part of DOS 5, we also get the wonderful introduction of Visual Basic. So, and we're going to make sure that we understand that we're going to break Visual Basic into 3/4 categories. This is the beginning of the first category of Visual Basic. This is the VBX category. So what makes the VBX category interesting and its appeal is the fact that third parties could also create extensions for this, and therefore you were not stuck with what came in the box. If you were willing to spend more money, you can make it do just about anything. And of course, all that VBX stuff was written in something else, like C. And then of course, again, little touch on, that other technology that's coming at us like a freight train. So VB2 comes out, and there's a student release version of it, because Microsoft's still trying to pimp it pretty hard. And it's pretty good. Comparatively speaking, if you tried to write a Windows program in C, and then you saw Visual Basic, and you still chose to write programs in C for Windows, I don't know what was wrong with you. Write extensions, to build on top of Visual Basic, that was the better idea in my mind. Which leads me to another point, 1992, is that up to this point, basic programmers did not write in just BASIC. The idea of a polyglot software developer, most basic programmers naturally had to fall into. BASIC would only get you so far, so then you would do something else. On the small computers, it was learn assembly. And then you could stuff it into data statements, and then you could load that into, and you can execute assembly machine code from BASIC because, we were still hard-headed and said we had to write it in BASIC to begin with. So Visual Basic had that same issue, especially in the VBX era. If you wanted to do more with Visual Basic, you would write VBX extensions that could then, in C, that you could then leverage inside of Microsoft Basic, so you didn't have to do the grunt work of, 1,000 lines of code to print hello world on the screen. Of course, VB3, this marks the end of the first generation of Visual Basic. And, oh boy, we get version 1.1 of QBasic. And the VBA begins to start taking shape. 1994, this is basically where my slides start to get pretty empty, because it's more of me just talking about what I'm running into. So about this time frame, I will be honest, VB 1 through 3, I had no interest in. When it came out, I was like, I get the appeal, but Windows 3.1, Windows 3.0, why? It's slow, it's sluggish. Why? The idea of fast video cards didn't exist at the time. It's a graphical UI. And I'm like, well, I can just make my own graphical UI. And make my own graphical UI. 1994 is, that was when I was truly a professional developer. So let me back up for just a couple of years. During high school, I wrote my first professional application, sold exactly one copy. It was Thoman's Invoice Tracker. I was a teenager, male. Figure it out. Yes, the name was on purpose. So that was my first professional software application. And then, of course, my community contributions, the BBS doors. It was a pretty large community. And then while I was at Radio Shack in the around 1990, a person was there, introduced me to a little bit more programming stuff, was kind of a mentor, and he went off to go work somewhere else. So he comes back later and says, we need to build computers for this new company I'm at. And are you interested in potentially, interviewing? And I said, sure. So he said, oh, go to lunch and do an interview. And I said, sure. So the owner of that company, he and him were in the front seat of a car, and I'm in the back seat. We're driving to go get something to eat, and the interview is basically taking place. So yes, I actually had an interview in the back seat of a car. So, and I was hired on the way to go eat. So I did well in the back seat of the car.
What's that acronym?
So I go work at this new company, and it's a company that's writing automation software for radio stations. And while I'm there, it's literally the company that writes the first digital on hard disk automation system. And in the process, we're trying to find additional ways of generating digital audio off of hard drive. And at one point, we did look closely at exploring the sound, the DAC that's on the Tandy 1000s. They weren't even good enough for AM. So eventually, we ended up really. There's a little animatronics action that takes place at a big company in like either side of the country. So Disney had these cards, and we started using those cards to do digital audio. So they're very expensive and troublesome, problematic, but hey, they worked. And so this buddy of mine, my mentor, is building the software, and of course, at the time, it was completely GUI based. I mean, sorry, not GUI based, text based. The entire UI was nothing but text and color. 640, not 640, 80 by 25 screen type thing, right? So by 1991, I learned I'm still back here, basic professional development system 7, not interested in VB. Because why? And I mentioned the hardware acceleration thing. Windows wasn't really that hardware accelerated at the time either. However, there was a small company out of Las Vegas called FastGraph, Ted Gruber Software's FastGraph, and I started looking at that for game programming because I was still interested in writing games. I was somewhere under the delusion that I was going to be a game programmer. Apparently I'm still under that delusion. And so I started looking deep into that. And of course, basically what that library was nothing but a bunch of assembly language optimized code for drawing to the screen. And at the time, if you don't remember this, not all video cards were the same. So you lived in a world where you could write for one video card, but it wouldn't work on the other 10. So they actually did the hard work of figuring out how to get it to work on all the available video cards. So I didn't have to do any of that, and it was all in assembler. So in BASIC, I was able to compile in Quick Basic and have assembly language doing all the really grunt work for doing all the drawing to the screen. So again, moving forward, by 1993, that product that my mentor had made had been, gaining good ground. But I kept looking at it, and of course, I'm not a radio person at that time. I made computers and wrote software and was a hobbyist. But I'm sitting here looking at the software, and I'm going, but that doesn't look like what the original hardware it's replacing looks like. Can we make it look like what the original hardware looked like? Well, no, we can't do that. Why not? That's what games do all the time. So at the beginning of 1993. I took on a project of actually transforming what he built, rebuilding it with now a graphical user interface using a game programming library to build software for radio stations that eventually was running across 2,000 radio stations across the United States and elsewhere, not Australia. Funny story there. Australia came over. They evaluated the software. Here, that puts us about here-ish. And they evaluated the software. They thought it was wonderful. It was amazing. It did everything they could possibly want it to do until they learned it was written in BASIC. Not a made-up story. They then decided not to pursue it further because it was actually written in BASIC. Now, by this time, not only was it in QBX, the program was so large it could not be loaded in qb.exe or qbx.exe. I had to use an external editor to edit all the source code. It was that big. I learned about this thing called dgroup. Anybody ever heard of that? No? Did you know you can only have so many variables available to you? It's true. You can only have so many. In addition to that, you know your strings actually exist in memory somewhere inside of your executable?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, can only have so many of those. I ran out of them. My executable was 2.5 meg in size in QuickBasic on machines that only had roughly 575K of memory available. So another product that I learned about was this thing called linking. Obviously, QuickBasic had a linker that came with it. But then there was another wonderful product called Blinker from Blink Inc. If anybody has any documentation on that anywhere in the world, please send it to me because I can't find it on the internet. So I have the software, but not the documentation. So Blink Inc. 2.5 meg executable. And what it would do is it actually was, it kind of was inspired by this thing I was ignoring, Windows 3.0. Windows 3.0 has the concept of multitasking. Cooperative multitasking. What does cooperative multitasking mean? Let me do my part. I'll wait. Let you do your part. And then it cycles back to you eventually. Okay? So it's not really multitasking. It's just subtasking. My automation system that I built was doing a very similar type thing. And it was able to load and unload entire portions of itself and to give this illusion that it was bigger than it truly was. So, in other words, I did things in QuickBasic that nobody in their right mind should ever do.
Like dynamic loading.
But by God, I am stubborn and I'm going to do it in BASIC whether you think it's a good idea or not. 1995 rolls around. We decide that when Windows 95 is coming down the pipe. Around this time, I was also getting my introduction into this big company I've mentioned a couple times, Bill Gates, and started doing beta testing. I actually beta tested the Microsoft mouse because that was a thing. And obviously, I was beta testing Visual Basic. I was beta testing, the Chicago, which was what became Windows 95. And yeah, there was absolutely no reason for me to ever think about writing for Windows 3.0 and 3.1, because why would you do that? However, this did mean it was time for me to make the jump to doing Windows type development. Funny enough, Visual Basic 4.0 was also in beta testing. And VB4 did a couple of things. One, it was the move from 16-bit to 32-bit. It was still not compiled, which is really annoying. However, you know what? There was this other thing that was compiled. Remember I said polyglot? Pascal's pretty cool. Delphi's pretty cool. Delphi could do multi-threading in a way that VB could never do. And I could write extensions for VB. So parts were written in Delphi, but most of it was written in VB. So that's my beginning of Visual Basic. So if you ask me specifics about VB 1, 2, and 3, I'd be like, I don't know. VB 4, 5, and 6, what do you want to know? However, if you ask me, do I want to get back into writing VB 6 or VB 5? No. But I remember it fondly. And again, I make this mention of this other stuff that's happening. So 96, unfortunately, the company that I was working for was having difficulties paying their bills, including people's paychecks. So this leads me to a couple of different problems. So quickly, I ended up working. I actually stopped working there and got into web development. 96 is about the same time that Internet Information Server came about, still in beta, which had active server pages, still in beta. I thought I was going to get a job having to do something called Cold Fusion, which was a scripting product. So incidentally, I went to Tandy Corporation. So somehow I ended back at Radio Shack. But this time I'm working in their TIS department, and I'm responsible for migrating all of their websites from Sun Solaris to Windows NT 4.0. Again, still in beta. So that was how I got back into Radio Shack and active server pages, VB script, and continued to do basic there. However, I ran into a couple of projects. I mentioned Power Basic. They had something called the PBCC compiler, which was awesome. Actually, it's PBCC, PB console compiler. So there's an extra C in there I shouldn't have in there. So I was able to pull off magic that nobody else there could do. And as it turned out, I can read C++. And when I got source code from Microsoft on how I needed to do something to solve a problem they've been trying to solve for 3 years, I was able to solve that problem and be done with it. It's a stupid problem. People needed to be able to change their password, and they wanted to be able to do that on a web page.
What?
It didn't actually exist at the time.
That seems like security
Yes.
failure 101.
So I helped make that happen, whether or not it then eventually made its way up the chain to actually be an IIS in the future because I helped make that happen. I don't know. I have no direct evidence of that, but I can tell you I was first. But Microsoft sent me the code that I had to reverse engineer in order to apply into IIS. And doing that, I could write my own ticket at Tandy at that point. So no, I no longer wore a tie. Yes, I wore jeans on a more regular basis. And I could do whatever I want. But I was responsible for the majority of the websites from a technical point of view. There were people who did all the artwork. Those were the same people that were doing the catalogs and the advertising campaigns and so on and so forth. And that's how I started learning things like Photoshop. Fast forward a little bit from there, still doing all Microsoft stuff, working with SQL Server, the database administrative team, the people responsible for the servers. They just let me do whatever I want because whenever they said, we can't do that, I'll do it. So I became their responsible. I was responsible for all of it. And then this little thing happened around towards 2000. The dot bomb. In which case I then was out of a job. I'm skipping a job in between there just to cut things short. And I learned that I needed to get more. I never wanted to be in a position where I could never have a job, not be able to get a job. And so this thing happened in 2001. We'll call it 2002-ish. I was actually involved in it earlier. Microsoft.NET and Visual Basic. And that's what I've been doing for the last 24 years. So if you have any question about .NET, I'm very involved. How involved? I was a Microsoft MVP for 12 years, and which got me inside track to things that are now past NDA, so I can talk about them. And it's an amazing product, but in the last 4 years, I started really getting interested. There's some things about VB that has always bothered me. And I think what it is Microsoft kind of lost track of who is VB for. And they think it was always for the professional developer because that's where the money was. And I feel like Basic has lost a little bit of who it was for. And so I created gotbasic.com. And gotbasic.com is where you can go and look. There's a basic for everything. And if there was any way that the basic community could come together and join forces amongst one another, it would be an unstoppable force. And I do think there's a positive future to not only basic in general, and there are plenty of them. Please look at the ones that are available. Free Basic, Spec Bass, BBC Basic. BBC Basic has a story of its own that is amazing. Take a whole presentation in and of itself. And there's I'm starting a new project called QBasic.com. So it's a community QBasic because, like I said, insane. And as far as like the future of Visual Basic, because how many times did I mention Bill Gates, de facto standard? So as far as VB goes, I think its time with Microsoft is over. It just hasn't been 100% figured out yet. And it's time for the community to take Basic back into its own hands. And there is movement happening on that. There's ModVB, which is basically an alternative VB compiler. It's actually written by one of the people who designed, one of the co-designers of the Roslyn project, which is the actual C# and VB compilers themselves. He was project manager on the project. So I've actually written, captured and taken control over a community version of the entire Visual Basic runtime. So that now belongs to us and it's under our control. And I have a third project that I've worked on that is VB Pixel Game Engine, which gives us the ability to drive pixels across platform using the native compilers of .NET in Visual Basic on Mac and Windows and Linux. Whether or not it actually works on Mac, to be determined. I don't have a Mac. So, but in theory it should, because the APIs I'm using should exist on Mac. So I do think there's a future, but the future is us, belongs to us. It always has belonged to us. And it's time for us to stop relying on somebody else doing it and us as a community to start taking control of our own future. And there are people doing it. We just need to have more people come together. So I think that pretty much brings us at time. So any last minute questions?
Well, you're 1 minute short, but yeah.
Okay, so we got 1 minute to ask questions. Yes.
Growing up, I had a Cory basic add-on.
Yep.
What basic was that?
That was based on Microsoft.
Based on Microsoft?
Anybody else?
So I grew up with TRS-80.
Yep.
Basic, and then I fast forward and then I go to undergraduate in the late 90s and I learned Visual Basic, and it was like, it was totally different.
And I agree with you. And I think there was something lost in that transition. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to working on QBasic, because there's a feature in it I want to have in there called a graduate button. And so when you hit that glass ceiling inside of there, have the ability to transition to Visual Basic. But don't muddle you with the complexities of what that is. Let's start with this nice little playground that you can get your feet wet and then grow from there. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a question. I have a comment. So you
Yeah.
started about anybody who has a textbook that has basic programs.
Yes.
I don't have a textbook, but I have some little novellas that actually have, they're called micro adventures.
So I have those.
Yeah.
I do have those.
Pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely. My daughter is actually going through some of those.
Nice. My dad has some old magazines that have basic code in it.
So magazines, it's specifically the textbooks because surprisingly, they're like gone. They're a relic of history that we can't find anywhere, but they were pervasive. Every textbook had basic code in it. And you could get on any subject, if it was a scientific subject of some sort or a math subject or anything like that, it would have basic code in there. And it was kind of a generic basic, like I said, that Dartmouth version 5 level basic, because most other basics said, yes, we have to do at least this. And then they added to it themselves from there. So yeah, if there's ever a textbook, those are the ones I'm looking for.
We know where one is. It's an old chemistry book.
Uh-huh.
It's like really old, and it has basic programs and stuff.
So even if they're not willing to give it to me, I'd love to at least get
Or just know what it was.
snapshots of it.
Or yeah, the publisher.
Yeah. The relevant parts in it that have to get pictures of it so I can show people what that was. But if they're willing to give me the book, that's even better. So was the talk informative? Hopefully, yes? Okay, good. Thank you. I could probably do it for another 2 hours. So, good thing is there a table over there? Yeah, he knows.
You can go for way more than 2 hours.
So actually the guy in the back there raising his hand like that, he's actually been to a lot of my VB specific technology talks, because I've been doing speaking for a while. And of course he can attest to it. What language do I do regardless of what people expect?
Oh, it's basic.
Yeah. I am not afraid. I am also on record as being probably the only person insane enough to actually do a Visual Basic talk at a C# SIG. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.